everybody. I am Jo Hudson-Lett and I'm the arts producer for Revolution Arts. And welcome you here today because we're going to be hearing from Luton artist Sophie Gresswell. Sophie Gresswell was a recipient of one of our Black Lives Matters commission, which we put out a couple of months ago. And this was a commission in order to let artists have time and space to think, and to also, if they wanted to react. And so what we'll be hearing today is Sophie's response to our commission. Now, Revolution Arts is one of 30 CPPs, that's Creative People and Places, and we are funded by the Arts Council. Normally you would find us at Marsh House in Luton, but due to the pandemic, you can find us here on Zoom. So welcome everybody, and I'm now going to hand you over to the wonderful Sophie Gresswell.
Hello everybody, and thank you, Jo, for that introduction, and thank you to Revolution Arts for making it possible for me to do this and to do some work in progress and share it with you all this evening. So I'm just going to run through how the event's going to run this evening. If you're one of our lovely guests in our Zoom room, can you please make sure videos are off and you're on mute for now, because we are recording. We're on Facebook Live as well as this Zoom chat, so we are recording, and we can't have you on video. So please make sure you're muted and your video is off. We will be doing a Q&A session at the end of the session. So during the whole thing, if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat box. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen, you should have a little chat box there. And please do send the messages, and they will be read out at the end of the session today. I do have to just give everybody a warning that some of the content, there will be sensitive topics talked about tonight, so there is possible strong language, and there will be conversations and visuals referring to death, slavery and burial. So just be aware that will happen tonight. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this whole project and how this has come about. So the whole project itself is called Ancestors Protect Me, and this is the third and final of 3 talks that we've had this week. We've been talking to artists, and today it's my sort of turn to share what I've been learning this year about my own history. So early in 2020, a thought occurred to me, and that thought was, if I could find the masks of my ancestors, perhaps they would protect me. And this itself was a raw response to 2020, COVID-19, living in lockdown, isolated within our own thoughts and experiences, and also, of course, the tragic death of George Floyd, the subsequent focus on the Black Lives Matter movement. And this kind of collided with me becoming aware of my own heritage and history, and what we're going to be talking about tonight, which is the unmarked burial site of Ruperts Valley in St. Helena, which is where my grandfather was born. So we will talk about that a bit later. As well as getting this Revolution Arts grant, I was lucky enough to get Arts Council funding to extend the project. So that series of talks with artists happened, and we had the lovely Afia Campbell and Mauriam Grillo yesterday talking about their own experiences. And on Monday we had Scottish artist Hannah Levery and our local artist Sydney Bellamy talking about their experiences and what 2020 has meant to them. And we will hopefully be posting up those videos in the new year as well for anyone that missed those. So there'll be another chance to see them. So tonight I'm going to be sharing some work in progress with you all. Please do keep in mind it is work in progress, so I'm still working on it, and these things are still sort of coming out of my brain, so bear with it. And it's the first time that I'll be sort of performing them to anybody, so yeah, just be aware of that, and if I trip over myself, please be kind. So the site that we're going to really be talking about today is called Ruperts Valley on the island, the British Overseas Territory of St. Helena. And this site, Ruperts Valley itself, is home to a mass burial site approximately 8,000 liberated Africans from the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. So when the slave trade had finished and they were trying to capture ships and unload the cargo, as it was then called, they used St Helena as a point to do that, because it was in the middle of the transatlantic and on the Middle Passage route which slave traders would have taken. So as they were unloaded, of course, in the state that conditions that they were in, it was inevitable that unfortunately people would pass away on the horrendous conditions, and that is what Ruperts Valley is really. It's the remnants of the Middle Passage, so it's what has been left from the transatlantic slave trade, and at the moment there's very little recognition, even though it is of global significance. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about where St Helena is, what it is if you've never heard of that island before. So I think we should have a little figure of St Helena up on your screens. So that little dot in the middle there, that's where St Helena is. It's in the Atlantic Ocean. It's got a population of around about 5,000, and it's about 5,000 miles away from Britain, despite it being a British overseas territory, and very British in the people that live there and the population. So a little bit of history about St Helena itself. It didn't really have any inhabitants until about the 1600s, apart from a couple of notable exceptions: a political prisoner in the 1500s called Dom Fernando Lopez, and a group of slaves who actually escaped from a passing ship around about 1557 and decided they would stay and live in St Helena to escape enslavement. After that, in about 1600s, the English took over the site as an idle spot and a strategic advantage point for their East India Company. And because of its place in the Atlantic, it was like a stop-up point for many ships. And this was from the Indian Ocean, so a lot of slaves actually landed on St Helena or were brought to St Helena from the Indian side of the ocean, so from Southeast Asia, from India, from Madagascar, as well as what we'll talk about later, which is Ruperts Valley, and of course the African and Atlantic side of slavery. So let's fast forward, and I think there are a couple of other pictures that we'll go to. Fast forward to 1924, and this is when my grandfather was born. And this is a little picture of him with his mum and sister and auntie on the island, actually on St Helena. So St Helenians are a real mix of lots and lots of different possible nationalities, but it's very hard to dig into heritage and know exactly where you are from because of this history of enslavement, prisoners and exile on the island. And the next photo will show my grandfather a bit older. He left St Helena when he was around 19 years old to join the British Navy. So that's him looking very suave and dignified in his Royal Naval uniform. So from what my grandfather learned and from what some people know about the island is the British history and the sort of colonial teachings of Britain and being British. The only really notable thing that my grandfather's generation and the generation since have been taught about any kind of exile on the island is the exile of Napoleon Bonaparte, who was sent there as an exile after the French Revolution. So there is a site there where Napoleon, his tomb where he passed away, it's been moved now, and there's where he stayed at the time. And really, apart from that European history, that is what St Helena has been noted for. So it's really only this year that I've really thought about delving into the hidden histories in St Helena, which include Ruperts Valley, which in the 1840s is where the ships would dock and unload the enslaved from the transatlantic slave trade. And if we move on to the next figure, it shows a little map of all the whole middle passage, the triangle of the middle passage that they called it, and all these areas where slavery operated and where slaves were taken and then the products were brought to Europe to use. And you can just about see in the middle there, St. Helena is there, that little dot there, where it says, I think there 51,000 may have been taken. Apart from this history, there's also a lot of murky British history about exile. So that I believe it was a prince of the Zulu nations was sent there. There was also prisoner of war camps for Boer prisoners from the Boer War on St. Helena Island. All of this history I never really knew about until this year. And yeah, it's been some shocking revelations for me. So that's just a little bit of background on the island and on why I felt necessary for me to make some work about my reaction to what's happened, and the fact that the site is unrecognised, there's no markers for the land, and that really it's a very poignant place for global history. It's where a lot of excavations for the Middle Passage have happened, and they found artifacts that you wouldn't find otherwise, because if the slaver ships weren't taken and unloaded right then and there, they would have lost those artifacts. So it's a real significant point globally, not only just on St. Helena and with British history as well. So I'm going to first read you a little poem that I've been working on, and then I will introduce the first two of our wonderful guests this evening. So this poem is called Deal with Death, and really it is a sort of, it's my raw reaction to finding out about this hidden history and how I've coped with dealing with unlocking a history which is quite unpleasant and which could be my ancestry, but that I can never really know. A deal with death. I used to squash death into the smallest box I could find and shackle him into the darkest corner in the attic of my mind. That stopped the day I found out about their graves. The day he confronted me, furious that I'd locked him away. He slapped me hard in the face. Not once, not twice, but about 8,000 times. Once for each body which they suppose has been left to seep in the soil of my grandfather's home. Those 8,000-ish skeletons hidden in our history's closet toppled on top of me and pinned me to the ground. Furious, I went to kick him in his downstairs dangly bits. It wasn't until my foot crushed on stone-cold carcass that I felt my mistake. I was the one to double over with watering eyes and laugh until I cried. Until I realized it wasn't death that I despised, but our will to forget. Suddenly, fear fled from me, and red-faced with relief, I looked him dead in his vacant eye cavities. I told death I would make him a deal. I wouldn't force him back into that little box in my head if he confessed all he knew about who they once were, and what that makes me. Then I would set him free, to live with me until my time to die with him. Death smiled at me then, and began to unravel his cloak to expose each one of his bleached out bones. He told me bearing history's broken truth was the best he could do without a heartbeat. He said all I could know are the shards of the hollowed out souls that still live on beneath our feet. They are all we have left. He said that they will never be people again, but that we must never forget they were people. Since that day, I let death move out of the recesses of my mind and take up permanent residence with me in my frontal lobe. It's thanks to death that I will never forget those lives. and it's thanks to their memory that I will never suppress death away in those chains again. Thank you. That was Deal with Death. So now I would like to introduce our first two guest speakers, Joseph Curran and Dominic de Vere, who are filmmakers. I'll just read a little bit of their bio for you. So Joseph Curran and Dominic Aubrey de Vere met whilst working at an independent cinema, where they quickly bonded over a mutual love of storytelling. They set out to find stories that were underrepresented in mainstream media. They won the Kerry Film Festival's Best Documentary Prize for ONRA, which I'm sure I've pronounced wrong, so please correct me, Joe and Dom, and have had their work screened at Camden Roundhouse, the Arnolfini, Moscow Centre for Contemporary Arts, and their mission is always to find vital stories in urgent need of spotlight, which has led them directly to their work on St Helena Island and their first feature-length documentary, which will be called A Story of Bones.
Thank you so much, Sophie.
Thank you, Sophie.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, off the top, just hearing your poetry and obviously meeting you has been, it's been an amazing part of the journey that we've been on. I think we're gonna give a bit of background and context to how we sort of became aware of the story in Ruperts Valley, and then we'll play a trailer and then talk a little bit after that. I think it's really moving and amazing to hear, the poem that you just shared with us. And I know that it's, like you said, it's a kind of work in progress, but I think it's beautiful. And I guess in a way it feels like almost like we're sort of coming towards the end of the journey of making the film, and it feels as if it's kind of organically now kind of lent itself to, the body of work that I think you're sort of involved in. I suppose sort of going back a bit and how Dom and I came to be, to become aware of St Helena, we actually went there. We basically sort of borrowed as much money as we physically could, and we went there with the idea of making a film about the opening of the island's first airport. So we basically just read a story about the fact that there was this place in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of, between Africa and Brazil, and we really didn't have any thoughts or ideas about its role in the sort of abolition of the transatlantic trade, or its unique position within the Middle Passage. And it was really more about, we wanted to make a kind of observational sort of documentary to do with how the island was going to change, because it used to be 6 days by sea, an amazing boat called the Royal Mail ship St Helena. We've spent about a month of our lives on that boat, and it was an amazing way to get to the island, because it really sort of got you in the mood for this slow kind of pace of life. But we got to the island, and when we were there, we went for 9 months, and we're going to make a film about this airport. And about maybe 4 months in, we found out about this story of Ruperts Valley, and we found out that these burial grounds had been disturbed, so this airport could be made. And it was just, I think it really struck us in a really significant way that actually there was a very, very wrong thing happening, that these burial grounds were kind of being pushed aside by what we saw as a sort of a colonial and systemically racist attitude to a site of real significance. And I guess that's what sort of pulled us through. Peggy is on this call with us today, and I suppose Nina's missing. Nina's the kind of Peggy and Nina have been fighting this fight, and they're both really important parts of our film. But really, that's how we came to know St Helena. And I suppose a bit of context before we show the trailer. Dom, I don't know if you want to say anything before we show the trailer.
Just off the back of what Joe mentioned about us going to the island. So we initially planned to be there for 9 months, at which time we thought that we would rather naively shoot and finish a feature film, and we'd come back and we'd sell that film, or we'd be able to kind of distribute the film. And that was 5 years ago. And I think, Joe mentioned that we're sort of beginning to come to the end of that process. But for us, I think it has been, it's been life-changing in many ways. To begin to understand this history, to meet Anina, who you'll see in the trailer, to connect with Peggy, through these relationships, the way that we've come to understand the significance of this site has transformed over the time that we've been making this film. And I think it can't be understated how important the site is there on St. Helena and what that represents. And I think Peggy speaks really beautifully to that story. But for us, I think it's been a really remarkable adventure, sort of diving into this kind of weird and wonderful place, this British island in the middle of nowhere.
So I suppose, yeah, in terms of sort of just sharing some key sort of narrative beats here, is that the airport was promised. They're basically within the island's history, there's a long history of colonialism, and it's quite shocking when you go there to sort of you feel like you're in a sort of part of England that's maybe like 30 or 40 years old or something like that. It's quite surreal. The airport was another sort of promise, a promise for the island's sort of economic future, from over here. The FCO and DFID have a history of making promises to the islands that they're going to kind of offer this like golden goose or whatever. And really what the burial grounds are kind of locked in is a system that I think is ages old, even goes to when the kind of site was in use actually in the 1800s, where there were the British government over here, they never even really resourced the island properly to deal with what was essentially almost the first refugee camps ever were on St. Helena, and these were those camps. So I guess the film, as we said before, we never really knew about the burial grounds until we got there. But as soon as we met Anina, it really transforms for us kind of the necessity to get this story out there, and to basically, as Nina says at the end of the trailer, to really challenge the status quo of it's out of sight, it's out of mind, and we can kind of just get away with whatever we want to do there. And that's kind of what hopefully what the film, when it's finally finished, we'll be able to do.
And to give you some context for the sort of the desecration of the burial grounds in St. Helena. So Anina, who I think we met her about 6 or 7 months into the process of being on the island for the first 9 months. And suddenly just something kind of clicked. We suddenly were talking to someone about this site in a way that felt more akin to the way that we were kind of questioning why this site hadn't been protected and why it was continually being kind of built over. And the site itself has, for the last 50 or 60 years, they've been slowly but surely building in and around parts of the burial grounds and uncovering human remains. And Ruperts Valley is caught up in a very complicated system in that it's effectively the island's kind of industrial hub. And it's earmarked to become a container park, but at the same time, it has this site that is of world importance. And it's not protected, and it's not being preserved to future generations. And to give you some specific examples around that, the power station that sits in Ruperts Valley was constructed in the 80s, and they uncovered hundreds of remains that were then thrown into barrels and effectively discarded. There have been numerous kind of constructions since then that also uncovered remains, and again, the finds were mistreated and basically kind of pushed to one side. And so the airport construction was just one of a number of intrusions on this burial ground. And really, Ruperts Valley is kind of caught up in this, as I mentioned, this sort of system whereby the infrastructure for the airport is really important in Ruperts Valley. And the reburial of the remains that were placed in the prison are kind of what we've been told over the years that we've been making this film is that once the infrastructure is completed in Ruperts Valley, these remains will be reburied. But they've been in that prison now for more than 12 years, and it doesn't feel any closer to a reburial than the 5 years ago that we started making this film. So that's really the context for how Ruperts Valley has come to be kind of desecrated. And as I mentioned, it's imaged to be a container park for future development, which again will incur on the burial grounds and some of the cultural heritage that's connected to the story of the liberated Africans that are a part of St. Helena's history.
Yeah, and I've just seen that Saskia said in the chat about the remains being put into prison, and I think Peggy will be able to speak to this in an amazing way as well. But just the language and the way that these sites are treated and the way the remains have been treated in Sophie's poem, talking about remembering, and I guess at the core of the film for us has been really a meditation on remembering and why it's important to remember. And I think all of these, actually Peggy says this in our film, in the longer thing, not in the trailer, but around sort of language and around all of these choices are really significant choices. And just because this place, let's be frank here, like St. Helena's a million miles away from anywhere, but it all ties, it's tied. This is a global issue, and it's tied to everywhere. In many ways, both politically and also in kind of an ideological sense. So that's become, I think, the film. This what we're showing you, this trailer, is kind of, in a way, it's just a taster really of what we hope the film is able to do, and through the amazing work of Peggy and of Nina and of the St. Helenians who have been a part of the process. And I suppose to sort of, in a way, to sort of round off the conversation, I guess for Dom and I to, I think for this process for us is about having the conversations, having those real conversations about our history. We can't hide, we can't put remains of human beings in prisons and hide that part of our history. We need to be having conversations. We need to talk about it. And that's what I really got from Sophie's poem as well, actually, was just that sense of, if you deny the past and if you don't look at the history, then you are kind of cursed to then reenact it. And that's, really what I think, Dom and I and Peggy and Nina have spoken a lot about, is just the need for this story to be out there so that there can be some kind of healing and some kind of acceptance of such a crucial part of our pasts, our collective pasts.
I'm just aware that, we've got a minute or so left, but just wanted to say thank you so much to Sophie for inviting us to be part of this. It's such an honour, and it's so exciting to hear about the work that you're doing. And I just can't wait to see where it goes. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie.
Thank you, Joe and Dom, and I really respect the endurance that you've gone to make this all possible, and I'm looking forward to you being able to produce the film, finish it, and really raise awareness for the site and what's going on, and with Peggy and Anina and their sort of championing the preservation and memorialisation of the site as well. So I really hope that happens. I'm going to read a couple more short poems and then a longer one for you now. There should be a little animation popping up and some artwork that I've been making to do with this too. Just some context before that happens. So the first two poems that I'm going to read are really around some finds that they had at the site, in particular beads and coffins. So it's a really interesting blend of sort of use of European items like beads that were given to women a lot on the slave ships to occupy them, I guess, and to sort of subdue them. And the way in which the burials uncovered on St. Helena actually show the way that the African women had taken these European beads and used them as a sort of African tradition of remembering the dead that had gone before, and especially in 4 coffins that were found in the site, which were contained fetus or infant remains. So it made me think about the way in which the generations they were stripped of everything, and they've had to reassimilate other things to find their own meaning and their own past in things that were stripped away from them. And also the sort of mourning that must have gone on Ruperts Valley, and how awful that must have been, and how we can relate to that today and not make these stories just figures, but make them really human stories, which they are. So I'm going to start. So if we could play the blue beads. They found ways to tame the blue beads which streamed down their cheeks and wrapped around their necks. Slowly, generation by generation, those blue buds of bloody sorrow would bloom into sapphires of deadly hope. Shoebox. He placed the smooth, cold blue beads against her warm, dark neck, shackled to another by a blood-red cord. She was not surprised when she gave birth to death. It took the sight of its size to bring on the storm, and shock crashed in through a cage he had bought to seal in its soul. It was the size of a shoebox. Look at your foot and think that through. A tiny lost life the size of your shoe. No clue as to who or why, forever left buried in between. On the surface, he tied white lace of a bonnet and placed the Queen's face carefully in British coins atop of each blind eye, pieces of silver to silence its stare. Beneath, she wove together thousands of European beads, entwined into a mortal mattress of African design, the memory of a culture resting under the death of innocence, a mother's lifeless hope laid down on the glass bed of red, white and blue, and buried in a box the size of a shoe. So as I said, that was about the infants and the fetus remains that were found in coffins, and one of them, I was listening to a talk about the archaeologists who excavated the remains, and just a comment, he said that one of the coffins was the size of a shoebox, and I just thought, my God, like you can't stray away from the human story when you picture that, and there's a child's remains being in a coffin the size of a shoebox. The next poem I'm going to read is a short one called Benjamin, Benjamin, which is more to do with us looking at my family tree, and the name Benjamin, Benjamin, which is the furthest we can get in looking at our ancestry. Benjamin, Benjamin. We pulled on a thin thread of our ancestral web. Sprawled in long-legged ink, we found the name of Benjamin, Benjamin. So we know that this is what they called you, a saint wrapped up in the silk spun from a sinner. Our thread stopped at a name that hung deadly deceptive, a hollow carcass of life in the truth we are left with. Benjamin, Benjamin may have been what they called you, but Benjamin, Benjamin was never your name. Another bit of context there, because slaves on the island were often given the first name of the slave owner they had, and that as a last name as well. So it's just sort of the pain that you feel when you get in that far into your family tree, and then you're hit with sort of this name that means nothing because it is stripped away of the actual name that the person would have had and given their slave owner's first name and that as a last name as well. The last one is a bit longer. This is another sort of of my reactions to everything and what that means for me today, as well as looking at our past history. This one is called When I Die. This morning, my alarm clock woke me up at 6 a.m. I don't do early mornings, so I grabbed the bastard and I threw him hard against my wall. That shut it up. Tell you what, I'd rather be resting in eternal sleep than be woken up by that bloody thing ringing in my ears. but it did make me think. When I die, I'd like to be buried. Something about laying back into the earth, letting my bones nurture new growth. That's kind of comforting, don't you think? Then again, I can't stand the thought of being trampled on, of soulless shoes walking over me, stamping me out and leaving their imprint across my face, or at least what my face used to be. Perhaps not. When I die, I could go down in flames. You could enclose the burnt ashes of my life into little envelopes and send them out to every edge of the earth. Then maybe each part of me will reach a home I'd once known. You could even scatter my ashes in the sea, reunite me with sunken souls who couldn't breathe. Perhaps not. One thing I would like is space when I die. I can't bear the thought of being pushed up against some other body, limb to limb, eye to eye with another and another and another and another. All ourselves melting into a mix-up, a cadaver casserole served cold, untold. Our minds sinking into mud and our hearts into dirt, and no headstone in place to set us apart. When I die, please leave a mark for me. So if you need to, you can find me again, so I can stop screaming into the void of eternal sleep. Screaming, I wake. The scream of my alarm clock lets me know it is still very much alive. Turns out I hadn't killed it, and I didn't die. The restless sound must have burrowed into my head. Even so, it still feels like it happened to me. I know new footsteps wear away old fates, but that ground still pounds silent screams of the dead, and I just can't get that sound out of my head. If only we learnt how to listen, perhaps then I could rest in peace. That was When I Die. So, to move on now, I believe, let me just check. I think we're going to hear from the wonderful Peggy King Jorde, who you saw a bit in the trailer that Joe and Dom showed just now. So let me just read you her bio. I mean, as you can tell, she's an amazing woman and activist, so I'm really delighted to have her here this evening. Peggy King Jorde is a Harvard University Loeb Fellow and Cultural Projects Consultant, recognised for her extraordinary leadership in cultural heritage and historic preservation, and her activism in saving New York City's National Historic Monument of African Burial Ground. King Jorde lends considerable focus to project development, consulting and lecturing aims towards building awareness and advocacy for marginalised communities and cultural heritage in the US and abroad. And she is currently lending her insights to government and community stakeholders on the island of St. Helena, and mounting a global call of action and campaign to protect them and memorialise the 8,000 unmarked burials and 325 unearthed human remains that are located in the prison of enslaved Africans retrieved from slave ships en route to Americas. So yeah, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Peggy King Jorde and say thank you, and take it away.
Thank you. I'm speechless, and I'm incredibly honored, Sophie. First of all, to hear some of your work in progress, to be a part of this special event, which clearly is aimed at really bringing more awareness through art, as well as through the history and activism. And you know, I'm just really honored to be a part of it, and I'm glad to be here as well with a number of my colleagues, Joe and Dom, and I know that our friend and sister Helena is also here with us in spirit. She's actually creating another generation, all right, more descendants that will, I'm sure, hear good things from down the line. That that piece was amazing, Sophie. I mean, I'm thinking about how you're talking about death, but your words are going to live on no matter what. So I would really relish hearing more of your work. It's been about 30 years since I embarked on working on the African burial ground in New York City. I served as New York's first Black mayor's special advisor on the project. I also later on served as a project director for the memorialization of the African burial ground. And I never imagined 30 years ago that I would still be working on sites like this, sites of conscience, sites that have been ignored, disrespected, and basically experienced development as being weaponized against cultural heritage, and particularly cultural heritage of African people. And the transatlantic slave trade and enslaved people, this history that has been obscured, that has been ignored. And here we have an opportunity with every find of an African burial ground, no matter where it is in the world. It's an opportunity for us to recapture, to unfold, and reclaim our history, reclaim the dignity and the respect that these sites deserve. So it is really a pleasure to know that even after 30 years, I'm now embarking on this new journey with Joe and Dom and Anina and members of the community, the saint community from this incredible island, and actually saints throughout the world, because after launching a global call to action, I have been, many saints from the US and abroad have reached out in interest and concern, and certainly lending their support. What I'd like to do is I'd like to share through a PowerPoint, I'll narrate a little bit of my story. And I open with this cover slide simply to show you, these are images of people who were considered liberated Africans, only this group of individuals were from Seychelles. But I think that the expressions of on their faces are incredibly powerful and really, I think, speak to who we're talking about, the conditions, the history, and where we need to lend our attention when we talk about preserving the site. Next slide, please. So, ancestors truly have a way of showing up in my life, and with every generation, the messaging has been profound in fueling my efforts and my efforts to remember them, all of them, not just my folks, but all of them, as a way of reclaiming the family and friends, neighbors and communities, spouses and children, words, language, songs, art, musings, and culture that was lost across the Atlantic and aboard each ship and across every island and every plantation and the Americas. I moved from my native South Georgia to New York City 39 years ago to pursue a career in architecture, but by forces I can only describe as ancestral, my career took a transformative turn that led me to challenging government authorities in New York, who would spark outrage when they issued a gag order. And the gag order was intended to render invisible the human remains and the lives of an African people who had remarkably survived the Middle Passage. You see, I'm a descendant of enslaved people. I was born during the apartheid in America. delivered in the basement of a segregated hospital in Albany, Georgia. I am the daughter of a civil rights attorney who defended Martin Luther King, and a loving, no-nonsense, courageous mother and spouse who was a parent and a mentor to 5 independent, developing minds, and in her own right was a community activist and educator. I was the first Black child to desegregate my first grade class at a public school. And while I remember being called by many names, I was rarely called by my birth name. Even the white schoolmate who managed to demonstrate even the smallest civility towards me by inviting my participation on the school playground made a strange bedfellow, referring to me always as Little Nig. And 2 years before I entered that school, my father was beaten by a sheriff named Cole Campbell, a Georgia cracker and an officer of the law. While I was too young to remember it, this photo of my father bloodied was legendary and appeared in the New York Times. In the lower left photo, you'll find the sheriff pictured arrogantly showing off his collection of walking canes, one of which he used to beat my father for attempting to visit his client, who was a white civil rights student protester who had been arrested, jailed, and had had his jaw broken by other white inmates. Next slide. Oh, if you would, could you bring the slide back? I would just like to share, and when my parents passed and when my father passed, at his request, a brother of mine and I prepared, designed, built my father's coffin, the photo in the upper right-hand corner. Next slide. So it's no wonder why I experienced a deeply personal outrage when I had learned that the United States government authorities had issued a gag order attempting to squash the memory, lives, and history unfolding at the New York African burial ground. This was a story about my community, my history, and it mattered who would tell their story. Mounting a preservation campaign that threatens to go against the grain of government authorities and their agenda can reap consequences. And in order for a campaign to thrive, a groundswell of support would be needed from a community of stakeholders who understood the profound meaning of what I and others would try to achieve and what the broader national consciousness could gain. So I worked with others to galvanize preservation and community advocates, solicit the support of government authorities, political leaders, and influencers to help dismantle the cultural indifference that from the start plagued the site. Next slide. Eventually, it took an act of Congress to halt construction, call for a public hearing, which resulted in the scrapping of a portion of the original building design, and the funds were saved to be reappropriated for funding a comprehensive plan for honoring those buried at the site in New York's, and actually celebrating New York's African ancestry. After being appointed to work with a federal steering committee, I helped to advance a plan for a memorial design, an interpretive center, the reburial and the related ceremony for over 400 human remains that had been excavated from the site for the building, including the installation of several public art commissions. Next slide. The actual boundaries of the burial ground in New York extended about 5 city blocks, designated by the City of New York as a historic district as a way of guarding against future threats by development. We implemented public art commissions throughout the district, including bronze sidewalk medallions, sharing the site's history, and as inspired by a Chihuahua ritual icon a sculpture titled Triumph of the Human Spirit soars in Foley Square Park at the foot of the courthouse steps. You'll notice in the lower right photo, there is an aerial shot and the street reads Black Lives Matter. And the wonderful thing about the district and placing physical reminders which help reshape the cultural landscape, it permits with the Triumph of the Human Spirit, that sculpture transformed the use of a park that was barely used. And now when there are groups that are protesting issues that are important to communities, no matter what the issue is, that park is used. That sculpture, which was built to honor enslaved and free African people in New York, now becomes that ground zero for trying to shake the world and the community's consciousness up about whatever the issue is at hand. Next slide. Thank you. Internationally recognized artists were commissioned to design works respecting the history and memory of thousands of enslaved and free Africans, and installed within the federal building interior and public spaces as a way of reshaping the cultural landscape and engaging people to gather and reflect on the history and the cultural significance and the need for shifting the nation's consciousness. And here is again another example of how physical reminders, how celebrating through art and through ceremony can engage people in a way, can keep us mindful about those issues that are most important to us. And so this space actually is a rotunda space within the federal building, which sits within the burial ground where 400 remains were displaced. And at center of this building and in the lobby is the rotunda, and an artwork was placed there. For the first time a couple of years ago, when Joe and Dom and Anina came to visit on a tour through parts of, we took a tour, a road tour through the South, but they also came to visit the New York African burial ground. And we held, I reached out to the National Park Service and actually gave them an idea, or proposed the idea of having a roundtable discussion with the artists who did work in this building to memorialize the African burial ground, preservation specialists, people from the World Monuments Fund, historians, librarians, authors, just a number of important folks to have a roundtable discussion to learn about St. Helena and its history, to hear about the projects that they were working on, and to, you know, open and to remember those who were buried there. And that hopefully going forward, and it was the inaugural Ancestors Feast, and I co-hosted it with the National Park Service. And it was the first time that the federal government let anybody actually have a sit-down dinner, a gathering. And here we were. To me, it was a prime example of sustaining power of place, reminding people where we were and where that building sits. Next slide, please. So the success of the New York African Burial Ground ignited a movement towards preservation, equity, and awareness. The development of new academic curriculums with the promise of truth-telling, conversations surrounding reparations, cultural heritage, and who controls the narrative going forward. And this is an important conversation. It's something that I think that we're going to, that needs to be worked on when we talk about it's a key element of preservation on the island of St. Helena. And something that I found in some of my research, and these images, the tree in the background is the tree presumed to be the one that's mentioned in the slave auction, to be sold and let, that they would meet under the trees for selling enslaved people. And then the piece in the middle is a description from a vintage paper, the London Daily Mail, which I thought interestingly described, and St. Helena's always being seen through others' eyes, and perhaps not enough through the people who really can tell the story. And it talks about how many settlers, the settlers who came, and that others who were enslaved from Madagascar, and that the result of the island, as it's described, is that it is a colored race, and that is who St. Helena is. And this is, I'm sorry that somehow I missed the year, but that this is a description of the island in the London Daily Mail, a vintage paper. So surrounding reparations and cultural heritage and who controls the narrative going forward, race, cultural agency, and more. And now the remarkable people of St. Helena and their troubled African burial ground story has set all of us on another leg of this journey. Next slide. So you'll recall my mentioning how ancestors have a way of showing up in my life, and that with every generation, the messaging has been profound for me and has informed my journey in interesting and relevant ways. Well, with the discovery of my great-great-grandmother, Annetta, on the left, the upper left, who was white and born in England, and her Black husband, my great-great-grandfather, John James, formerly enslaved, but who escaped to Canada, where he gained his freedom in Kent, Ontario, near Buxton, a town founded by and for formerly enslaved Africans who had escaped to freedom. I can't say how great-great-grandma Annetta found her way from England to Canada and started a family with a formerly enslaved man, devoted to and in allyship with a Black community of neighbors who represented Black Lives Matter, a Black Lives Matter movement in its day. But it is profound for me and informs my work with St. Helena and the Saint community. Next slide. The slave trade has forever connected our histories, and the work that I've set out to do, and that we've all set out to do, is to help advocate, lobby, mentor, unfold, repair, and cultivate globally the historical ties that bind us while advancing cultural and historical integrity. I relish the time that I spent with so many on the island of St. Helena, meeting with community representatives, historians, the museum folks, and you know, being able to speak to everyone about the island and who they really were. And I also relished the opportunity when Anina and Joe and Dom were able to visit me and come to my home state of Georgia, and to visit and to see what I saw as a way of connecting and seeing that our histories were deeply connected between St. Helena as a Middle Passage island and me as a descendant of enslaved people. Next slide. So, so this is just so that, just in a little bit more detail, and you've heard a little bit about this earlier, but this is Ruperts Valley. And since working on the project, there are stakeholders on the island by way of the Liberated African Advisory Committee. You have the Human Rights Commission, you have the Saint community at large, and you have global stakeholders who are, who agree that the site within the valley of Ruperts Valley, there is a building structure that apparently was one of the last standing buildings within the Liberated African Depot. And so preservation, and as I've exhibited through the African Burial Ground in New York, preservation of tangible reminders are really key. So in the upper right-hand corner, you have a photo of, and I don't know if you can tell it, it is actually a wall, which really struck me. I mean, it was very powerful. And when Anina pointed out for me the wall that was hand-built by enslaved Africans who were in the African Depot, who had to build this garden wall, and they tended to their small garden there, and that it still stands, and that a building that may have served as an infirmary when these people were there, it still stands. And the idea that these places can be preserved and interpreted and included in an overall design that could really communicate to visitors and to people, generations of people, about the history of this site. On the lower right-hand corner is just the facade of the prison storage room where the remains that were removed are being stored. And so basically, by way of just this collage, it is to really support and make you aware that there is a fight to keep that building, as a possible interpretive center, the fact that there's a need for the remains that are still in storage beyond, far beyond 10 years, that there needs to be a reburial with an appropriate ceremony. And then things like the garden wall and how important those features are, and yet that wall is under threat because there will be the design currently being proposed will impact it adversely. Next slide. So here's the development plan, the Ruperts development plan, which shows you the container storage park that is proposed. And I've took the liberty of juxtaposing it beyond the garden wall and sort of asked the question, what if? What if? I mean, that is what's planned for this wall. And what if we can change that? I mean, we need the voices of so many people globally. We need the support of politicians, of influencers to help change the course of this development, change the course of how this is preserved and the story that's told and how people will come and experience it. Next slide, please. So I'm just demonstrating and sharing that I've worked lobbying influencers, political leaders, international organizations, and more to help build a groundswell of interest and support to save this site and celebrate its significance. And so earlier this year, I was able to visit with Dom and Joe, and during that time, I managed a meeting with various members of parliament, David Lammy and Diane Abbott, also scholars. And prior to my visit, I was able to reach out to former Ambassador Andrew Young and have a conversation with him about this important site. And this is over the past year. There is a woman who is Oku, who is pictured there, and I shared the story of the African burial ground in St. Helena with her. Meanwhile, she is simultaneously and has been for years fighting the fight in London for a memorial that honors victims of the slave trade. I've shared St. Helena's story through the Remember Slavery group with the United Nations, and in the lower right-hand corner I gave a talk, a short talk at the Senegalese embassy. So this is, this global call to action, which has been posted on Facebook, this is so key, along with the film, along with the work that Anina is doing on the ground in St. Helena, and other saints who are being supported outside. It is a multifaceted fight. It is a multifaceted movement, and we hope that that through this event that there'll be so many people who will then join our movement. And the final slide, please. Oh, not the final slide, actually. The best slide. No, you can, the next slide is that this photo, this selfie with the Saint community and the members who came to a wonderful event that Anina coordinated with the museum in St. Helena. And it was an exhibit. And the exhibit was, in fact, a photo exhibit put together, brainchild of Nina and photographers in St. Helena. And basically they replicated the positioning of remains as they were excavated. So if they were excavated through the photos of the remains and they were positioned in their graves, this was an amazing photo exhibit of members of the community, Saint community, lying on the ground and being shot in those same positions as families. Some of the burials had infants, that kind of thing. It was phenomenal. But I love this picture because it really shows the spirit of a community who has served as the cultural steward for the African burial ground and all of those wonderful, tangible reminders. And my final slide, please. So anyway, the saints, descendants, and global community of descendants must use this opportunity to demand the dignity and respect deserving of victims of the slave trade, and we must accept nothing less and envision something greater than ourselves. So let's do the work. Let's do the work, because it's the future generations of descendants of slaves that require us to make this right. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Peggy, and thank you for sharing your experiences so openly and honestly, and really taking on this call to action for the people of St. Helena and for us globally to come together and make sure that the site's not lost. So yes, as Joanna's put in the chat group, our Q&A section will begin in a minute. I'm just going to read one more poem, and then we will go to the Q&A. So if you have any questions, want to know more about, where you can find the work that's being done on the global call to action that Peggy mentioned, just pop it in the chat box and we'll come to that just after this poem. So if you can put figure 6 up onto the screen. So just this is a little painting that I've done that goes with the poem. And this is a tunji fruit, which is a cactus that grows on St. Helena. And a prickly pear is what it's called as well on the island. And it struck me when I was researching into it, these cactuses grow in valleys like Ruperts Valley, and their roots go really deep into the ground, and they were sort of entwined. So I had this vision of sort of the tunji fruits sort of being able to see what's going on and blooming from the remains of what was left behind. So it's going to stay up during this little poem. It's called They Live On Despite the Ants. And actually another bit of context. So white ants are on St. Helena Island. They're also called termites, but we call them white ants. And they were brought to the island from slave ships. And subsequently they came off and they destroyed a lot of the buildings that were wooden that were on the island. So I thought it was a interesting analogy to put the white ants next to the colonizers that came, but then also it's a call to say that we have to reframe history and think about, actually, is it the white ants that we want to focus on, or is it the other stories that were left behind? They live on despite the ants. White ants came to the island and colonized the ground. They quickly chewed through homes and built structures of their own upon the ruins left behind. But this is not about the ants. It is about how they came, creeping into crevices and crawling over people rammed aboard a ship, over skin and bone, and warm and cold, and live and dead. But this is not about the bodies. It is about their teeth, about the smiles that they once wore. It's about the families that used to dance and the children who used to laugh. The power of patterns carved into incisors, the identities held in the teeth that were taken, the bite of a land that they didn't know, the decadent decay in the devil's punch bowl. Silenced in soil that they would never nurture their seeds. No ceremony, no soul, no history, no fruit. Mass graves of the liberated enslaved. But this is not about their death. It is about how they live on. It is about how we tend to the grounds and grow from their roots. The tunji flower which blooms amongst the spikes of sorrow. The nutrients released from each human beneath. It is about what happens to them today and tomorrow. Do we protect their graves, talk about them and let them live on? Or do we let them die again? 8,000 deaths forever in vain. White ants still build structures of their own upon the broken bones left behind. But this is not about the ants. Thank you. Right, so I think we should go to Q&A now.
Sophie, I'm sure that you probably have some questions that you'd like to ask. So if you dive in first, I've got a couple, but yeah.
Yeah, well, what I want to do is just get Peggy and Joe and Dom just to sort of tell people what happens next in the next stages of what they're doing. So the call to action that Peggy's working on, and Joe and Dom, what happens next with your film and what you hope to achieve with it.
Yeah, so I think Dom and I are going into a process in January to starting the sort of proper edit. So we're hoping that the film will be finished by the mid 2021. That is said with a bit of a kind of pinch of salt, because we've been sort of thankfully Peggy and Nina are very patient, and we've been trying to finish the film for a long time. But it should be middle of 2021 that the film's finished. We don't know where it will be just yet, but the chances are that it will be called A Story of Bones, and hopefully, I mean, I don't think there's going to be any other films about sort of burial grounds on strange remote islands. So hopefully everyone watching will be able to kind of see that. But yeah, that's our plan, is that middle of 2021. And I think in terms of Ruperts Valley itself, it is important to stress that it is kind of under threat now. The film is, I think, going to be a really powerful tool to be able to protect the burial grounds, but it does require, like Peggy says, this sort of groundswell. I think the work that you're doing, Sophie, to to sort of interpret and to artistically respond to the story is really important. And so this platform that we have today is amazing for us. And thank you for, I know Dom said thank you, but thank you so much for giving us a platform to share the story. And hopefully, it will all kind of come together to be able to protect the burial grounds of St. Helena, and also to recognise that actually, St. Helena is one burial ground, but there are several burial grounds all over the world that are currently under threat, including in South Africa, in Brazil, in America, in England. And this is this is part of a much bigger conversation, hopefully, that we can all have about protecting these really important places.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, Joe, because there are, I hear from people all the time about various burial grounds, and I'm working on simultaneously on a number of other burial grounds. I will say, however, that St. Helena's burial ground, what is so remarkable for me is that it is, I call it a middle passage burial ground, because for those who understand the transatlantic slave trade, they understand that middle passage piece. And, you know, the Atlantic has always just sort of been this void. And suddenly St. Helena makes it, there's a destination, there's a stopping point. And to think that there may be descendants here who, you know, had ancestors who somehow that was a stopping point. It's really powerful. So where is the call to action, the global call to action? I continue to give talks. I'm invited to do a lot of the virtual talks and bringing awareness to people. As well, what is so important, and some people have done this, but we need a groundswell of people to do this. You know, it takes political will. You know, it's going to take money, but it also really takes political will to get behind a project and make it happen. And when I met with Diane Abbott, when I met with David Lammy, you know, St. Helena has a lot of needs. There are clearly a lot of other needs. But when you talk about funding something like this, the more people reach out to their representatives, their members of parliament, and say, hey, what do you know about this island? What are you doing? Can you check it out? It would be really, really important in order to bring pressure to bear on the powers that be on the island. Also to provide resources. And that's what's going to be needed as well, the resources. And so I'm reaching out to various organizations, but, you know, it is a British territory. While I am stepping in and through the United Nations, I've had talks and bringing awareness, that's been very helpful. But if people are there on the ground in England, write to your members of parliament. I've had people write back to me to say, I wrote my representative and I'm waiting to hear back. So that's incredibly important.
Thank you, Peggy. So funny enough, one of the questions in the chat for you about the story of St. Helena, obviously it's intrinsically linked with the UK history. And you've answered the question as what is the responsibility and the role of the African diaspora in the UK to tell our shared and connected history?
Yeah. Was that a question?
That was a question, but before I could actually answer the question,
I actually did it. Yes, good. Thank you.
You preempted it. We've had some wonderful comments in the chat as well. So powerful and moving. Saskia says, thank you very much, Sophie, for bringing this to light. And yeah, I think we all have to ditto that as well. So really, this is a question for all three of you. It must have been emotionally as well as financially draining, the work that you do. What is it that keeps you going? So actually, if I go to Dom and Joe first for that, because obviously you thought you were going out to, you know, film an airport.
Yeah. Honestly, if I had an answer to that question, I have absolutely no idea how we've kept on going. I think through the kind of kindness and generosity of friends and family. I think that it sounds a bit sort of wishy-washy, but we've been pulled into something that's so much bigger than ourselves, and it is hard to, you know, I have friends and friends of mine who are kind of putting down mortgages and whatever, and you know, I'm sort of you know, it has been difficult, but at the same time, the privilege to be a part of this process, and I always describe it like the train's just left the station, and you know, we're on board. And I think there'll come a point where we're not on that train, and I think actually that will kind of be a bit sad in a way. But we're for now and for the last 6 years and for the next little while, we're just, you know, this is just such an important story, and we're so privileged to be able to be in a position to work in the way that we're able to work with it. And I don't think I have any doubt. I mean, it sounds a bit crazy because I can't know this, but I just feel in my bones that this site is going to be protected. And you know, it really has. It's been tough. Like, you know, we've been into some very bleak places, particularly, obviously Nina's not here, but you know, Nina has fought unbelievably for this site. But I really genuinely deeply believe that and this conversation is an important part of what Sophie's doing. Honestly, it's so moving to us to see. It's, you know, Sophie's responses to this, like that's a whole nother part of this journey. But in a concrete terms, Joanna, I genuinely have no idea. But you know, don't ask questions. I say just keep on, you know, just keep on going. But yeah, it's such an important story. I think is the
yeah, and I was just going to add to that you know, when we went to the island back in 2015, and we thought, like you mentioned, we were making a film about an airport and then a plane that didn't land, and then we found this story, and we were sort of faced with this, like, is this part of the story that we were telling? And then clearly it was. And then it's like, what do we do? Do we kind of turn away from this, or do we realize that this is such, as Peggy spoke about, such an important site, and you know, it has to be protected. There's absolutely no doubt that it has to be protected. And I think in terms of like what's kept us going, it has been tough at times, but you know, working with Peggy and Nina has been inspiring. Like, they inspire us every day. Like, the conversations that we've had with them about their trust in us to tell this story, to help tell this story, the wisdom that they've shared along the way, absolutely invaluable to the way that we've understood this story and thought about the way that we're hopefully going to tell this story as filmmakers. And so we're, you know, in those low moments, and we all get on the phone together, and we all talk about what we had for breakfast and what we were doing the day before, and we talk about what's happening on the site and on the ground in the island and what Peggy's doing. Like, those are the moments that really galvanize me and make me sort of like as tired and kind of emotional as I feel about, you know, this story. It kind of pulls me through and just makes us absolutely determined to get this film out there and hopefully support the work that Peggy and Nina are doing in the right way, and for the burial grounds to be protected and preserved for future generations, which I think is what everyone wants.
Yeah. For me, it's the tangy British potato chips that keep me going. No, there's an inside story about that, because I do think the British have great tangy potato chips, and the guys always make sure I have them. Anyway, no, what keeps me going? I mean, clearly, I've been doing this. I say I've been doing it. It's been 30 years, but there was a major lull, and Joe and Dom know this, and Anina. And there was a major lull. There was a time where I kind of had to start raising my kids, and things weren't happening. And I thought, okay, that portion of my life is over. And then I received a long letter from Dom. I mean, an email that went on and on about this little island. And he did this over the course of almost a year. You did this like about a year, over a course of a year. And he just didn't let up. And I would read these long letters, didn't know who he was, and he would explain everything that was going on. And I share this story because I think that commitment and people feeling committed about stuff can be infectious. And when I learned more and more about the commitment from Dom and Joe, and then learning more about Anina, I think we fuel each other, though we are living in very different places, and we bring to the table whatever we can bring, whatever our gifts are, and that we respect one another. And that's why, Sophie, it's wonderful being a part of this, because here we are, you are a descendant of saints, and then you're using your art to speak to this same thing. And it is infectious, and it then fuels the rest of us to do whatever we need to be able to do to make this project happen?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a deeply personal sort of need for me to find out more about who I am and who I could be. And although it's very difficult as a saint to really be able to trace anything back, it also means that saints are very global people, that they're one of everything. So I think it's about sort of sharing the history, and the times that we're living in now, things get a little bit isolated and things get sort of nationalized and things, and it's very important to remember that we're part of a huge global history and a global story. And even though it's a tiny island in the middle of nowhere, it's a story that needs to be told. And my mum has struggled with, you know, belonging, and it's sort of passed down to me, I guess, in this we've been taught Britishness. We have no sort of culture to hang on to, we have no language to hang on to, but we've always been a bit other. But my grandpa's quite staunchly British in his outlook and his viewpoint about migration and things like that, so it's a real weird conflict for us. So it's just digging and then being made aware this last couple of years about these huge intertwined histories, and then me sort of finding out a lot about myself through that, and then trying to unpick that. So it's a personal thing, but it's also a hugely important thing for us to share with other people.
Thank you. I think we've got one last question. This is for Peggy. So with regards to there's a large movement around the decolonisation of collections in the UK. Do you have a take on this, Peggy?
Oh, I love it. I post a lot of those articles on, you know, on the global call, you know, the global call to action on Facebook, tied to St. Helena. You know, one of the biggest challenges with the African burial ground was, and I'll tell a very brief story. I was sitting in one of the early meetings in a United States government office where the project planning was happening for this building. And there were these regular weekly reports, and there were these archaeologists, the lead archaeologist at the time, it was not with Howard University, it was not being black led, but it was being led by, white led, and by another organization. And the gentleman who was the lead was telling a story, and kind of, he had been railed actually by people because he had been, you know, he misquoted something, or he made a statement that was really uninformed regarding the Black community. And I challenged him in the meeting because I asked him, well, who on your team is of African-American descent, or a historian or a specialist? Who are some of those Black leaders? Where is the Black narrative? And his response to me was, well, archaeology is an interpretive science. And, you know, we archaeologists, we write up whatever it is, however we interpret a story. And then the other archaeologists somewhere down the line, if they want to challenge, they kind of can come along and challenge whatever that story is. And I had a problem with that, because what was going to happen was we were sitting in a United States government funded project meeting, and this man was going to get to interpret the story without anybody from the community, anybody who was a specialist historian, somebody who could bring that kind of meat to the table and leadership. And he was going to tell the story, and the government was going to pay for it, and they're going to put it on beautiful paper, fold it up, and put it in a take one holder in a government building, and that was going to be God's truth. And my challenge was, or my response to that was, now is the opportunity for us to tell the story the way, in an enlightened way. And we need to have those people at the table, other voices at the table, to help tell that story. So when you talk about what's happening now, it's, you know, people talk about it, oh, you're trying to erase history. No, we're trying to edit history, Okay, we're just, and there's a line that says, the only good writing is rewriting. So it's time to edit the history.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think on that note, we've gone a little bit over time, but it was definitely worth it. So I would like to say thank you very much to Dom, Joe and Peggy, but for Revolution Arts, our biggest thanks goes to Sophie Gresswell, who has done an amazing pieces of work on this commission. And I know this has been emotionally draining. Sophie and I have been speaking on a regular basis, keeping in contact. And I think we could agree that you've been up and down, but what you've produced and the contacts and the people that have been here and the talks over the past 3 days has just been absolutely wonderful. So thank you very much, Sophie, to you.
Thank you everybody for being here tonight and being on the panel and being here as guests and listening, and yeah, let's hope the stories keep on getting told.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.